All right, and now let's move to the next presentation. Sorry to be pushy. Jorge, do you have your presentation ready? Excellent.
Ah, voilà, c'est ça qui m'intéresse.
And so now we have Jorge Emilio Roses Labrada from the University of Alberta, Genitive Classifiers in Piaroa-Mako.
No tingués la connexió, si no estàs mirant el news al mateix temps.
There's somebody talking. I don't know if like the person who is in charge can mute their microphone. Thank you, Rosa. As the title suggests, what I'm gonna be trying to do is talk about.
Can you please turn off your mics? There are the interpreters testing the sound, it seems. Go ahead, Jorge.
Okay. So what I'm gonna try to do is describe and analyze a system of genitive classifiers in Piaroa-Mako. And I will specifically show that while cognate between the two languages, some of the classifiers have different distributions that I'll try to reconstruct the classifiers that the two languages have in common. And I propose a possible nominal origin for the classifier. So it's really interesting that currently English is talking about a verbal origin for the NADEP classifiers. The outline is a brief introduction, then I'll present the generative classifiers in Piaroa, followed by the generative classifiers in Mako. I'll propose a reconstruction, both of form and function, then discuss the origin of these classifiers, and then I'm gonna conclude. In case you're not familiar with the languages that I'm talking about, here's a brief background on both of them. So Piaroa belongs to the Haudé-Saliban language family with Mako and Saliba, and also with Haudé. It's spoken on both sides of the Middle Orinoco River, and this is the border between Venezuela and Colombia. And so the language is spoken on both sides of the border, but the majority of the population is in Venezuela, as the numbers here in table 1 show. These numbers also show that the language is relatively vital. However, many recent cultural changes have led to the interruption in the transmission of traditional ecological knowledge and shamanistic knowledge. And prior to the start of a documentation project that I'm currently doing, there's been some linguistic description of the language, but mostly based on elicitation. For Mako, it's a member of the same family, is spoken in the middle of the Ventura River and its tributaries, so not on the border with Colombia. It's exclusively a Venezuelan language. It's a language that is relatively vital, but as with Piaroa, there's been an interruption in transmission of traditional ecological knowledge and shamanistic knowledge in the communities, and the existing description relies on my doctoral work. Importantly for this presentation, Mako and Piaroa form a branch within the family. So we're going to stay at this level of Piaroa-Mako. So the data comes from 2 different documentation projects. The Mako project was my doctoral dissertation project, and it was funded by a Vanier scholarship here in Canada. And I've been working since 2016 with the Piaroa community with support from the Major Language Documentation Program. The examples we're going to see are provided in this format. So they have 4 lines. The first line is the community orthography. And in the general sections, I've also added which language it comes from. The second line is the IPA transcription. Third line is the gloss. Fourth line is an English translation and an indication of the source of the example. In the case of naturalistic examples, this refers to the session number and the intonation unit number. In the case of elicited examples, they'll be labeled as elicited. So for both languages, the genitive classifiers serve a double function. So they work as a system, as a instrument for classification, Mako and Piaroa both have multiple systems of nominal classification. So you can take the noun universe and divide it along the lines of animacy into animate and inanimate classes. Within the animate class, you also have a gender distinction in feminine and masculine. And you also have classifiers, and very similar to the Tukanoan system that Rosa described recently. And then there's an alienability distinction in that some nouns are inalienable and others are alienable. And so this is where the generative classifiers come in. They also serve as a strategy for possession, and particularly with alienable nouns that take a generative classifier, and these usually do not take a prefix, which is a strategy for inalienable nouns. I'm not going to go into the other systems, but you can ask me about it in the question and answer period about the interactions of these things with generative classifiers. So in both languages, there are some nouns are alienable and cannot be directly possessed, and that means that they cannot take a possessive prefix. And for these nouns, possession is accomplished via a generative classifier, as in one. And what this means is a juxtaposition of a noun head with a generative classifier here. And then the possessor is marked on the generative classifier via a prefix. These include inanimate nouns, like here for pineapple, but also animate ones, as we will see in a few slides. I'll also mention that both elements in this construction are very tightly bound. And what I mean by this is that they occur on the same intonation contour. There's no pause between them, and there can be no intervening material between the two. Case marking or anything. There can't be anything that comes in between them. And this is this example from Piaroa, and this is the audio for it. So now that we've kind of covered the generalities of both languages, we can go into talking about the inventory of generative classifiers in each of them. So Piaroa has 4. The first one is ahi, which is used according to Crute for domesticated animals. And you can think of them as pets mostly. And so here's an illustrated example with dog. And so if you wanted to say my dog, you would have to have the pet classifier and then the possessive prefix on it. Attempting to mark possession directly on the word for dog results in an unacceptable item. So this is ungrammatical for speakers. Interestingly, and I'll use this later when we're talking about the nominal origin of these, this classifier can be pluralized. And so if you were talking about multiple dogs, you would say chahimu. And this is a plural marker for animate nouns that is used with a very small subset of nouns like children and some kin terms, but crucially it's different from the one that is on dogs. So the second one is unkwa, which is used according to Crute for animals that are fit to eat, and plants which provide food or other useful material. Here's an example with plant, here with corn, so they grinded their corn. And you have it here with unkwa, marked for a third plural possessor. And there's no description of this in the existing literature, but there's many examples in my corpus where it also occurs with a liquid, like a beverage. And so here is with jarake, which is a fermented drink, but you saw it in with yukuta in example number 2. The third one is onya, which Crute says is used with dead animals. And so here's an example, his peccary 2. He says it's typical mammals, but also fish and birds. And I have an example I'll show you in a moment with worms, but crucially, they can be eaten. This can be pluralized, but the pluralization, unlike with the other one, replaces the final syllable with a plural marker. And here's an example of the plural in a natural context. So his edible worms, and you can see the marking here. And finally, the fourth one is are, which is used for borrowed nouns and borrowed from Spanish nouns specifically. So here we have one with her money and one with my father's motorcycle. So my father, his motorcycle. What is interesting about these two examples is that it doesn't really matter whether the borrowing has been phonologically integrated, like as in perata, which comes from Spanish plata, or not, as in moto in 10. In both cases, they require the borrowed or like novel object kind of classifier. So this is largely a semantic system. And so interesting cases like this one pose a problem for which one to choose. So sardina comes from sardines in Spanish, sardina. And so it is a borrowing from Spanish and presumably could take the are classifier, but instead, because we're talking about food, is uquan. And I'll give a couple of examples in a moment from Mako of the same kind of resolution. So moving on to the Mako classifiers, there is a classifier used for pets, ahui. There are two examples here. The first one, ahui ariqueda, so with his dog. And awiri is the Mako term for dog. In the second one, with his pet toad, is using sapo, which is the Spanish borrowing. But crucially, the function of being a pet is what is important, not the fact that it's a borrowed term. And there is a cognate marker for the Piaroa-Mako, which we saw with edible nouns. But importantly, in Mako, this is more general. So it's for all inanimate objects, including those that are not edible. And so here, for example, is a naturalistic example with axe, which, as you can imagine, can't be eaten. And in elicitation context, you have them occur freely with all sorts of nouns, including edible substances. In this context, you can't do direct possession on it. So there's a preference for this construction for the nouns that denote edible items or foodstuffs, but there's no crisp judgment on the part of the speakers. So they accept multiple constructions with different nouns, and sometimes there's disagreement between speakers. Yeah, thank you. And ale, lastly, is also used for borrowed inanimate nouns from Spanish. We have it here with bed, so his bed, and my age, and then it's using the word for year. But I'm not presenting those examples, but with human animate nouns like novia, which is girlfriend and familia, it could occur with a borrowed or novel object classifier. So based on regular sound correspondences, and I'm happy to talk about those, they can be reconstructed in these forms. And Oña is not attested in Mako, and I say not attested rather than non-existent because it's not in my corpus, but it is very possible that it could be, I would need to ask the speaker. In terms of functions, ahui seems to have a very clear use. And for this one, what I would argue is that in Mako, the function has expanded. So The fact that food is ungrammatical in other constructions that only occurs in this one suggests that that perhaps was the primary function of it. And here again, novel objects. So Crute argues that the generative classifiers are based on the words for pet, corpse, food, and thing, respectively. I agree with pet, food, and thing, but not necessarily with corpse. My consultants always translate this as animal, and they claim that it's an animal that doesn't belong to you, but it doesn't have to be dead. And so there's support for this analysis in that these are used as referential nouns on their own. And I'll show you an example from Mako in just a moment. And at least the animate ones can be pluralized independent of what the pluralization strategy is for the noun that they modify. This agrees with the analysis of the origins of similar systems in Oceanic and other Native American languages. And here's an example of ale in a referential context to denote unspecified objects. You may be familiar with this, but this is a video from the Evans et al. 2004 stimuli for reciprocal constructions, and people are passing around different objects. And so the speaker says they're playing and exchanging their things with a thing of the other one. The speakers picked up very quickly that this wasn't real, that it was a fake situation, and so they often put playing at doing whatever the action that the video was meant to denote. And so in this context, it's translated as cosa, which means thing. But in the context where it appears with a noun, the speakers don't give it its own translation. They just say that it serves as a company to the noun. So they have this very clear instruction that it has a grammatical function. So to conclude, in terms of topology, I've shown you that Mako and Piaroa both have systems of generative classifiers. These systems are cross-linguistically rare. However, some of the distinctions are made within the system, like, for example, having a classifier for the semantic class of pets or domesticated animals is common in other languages of the world. For example, Eurosteken, and we just saw an example in Patty's and Cairo's presentation in NADEB. In terms of historical comparative linguistics, I propose a reconstruction for those forms that are cognate. And this perhaps has implications for reconstruction of the classifiers at a higher node that would include, for example, Saliba. And I've argued that nouns become or are the source of generative classifiers. And one interesting point, which I didn't go into here, is whether this is a result of language contact with Caribbean, which has been argued to have a similar system, but perhaps with more terms. And so the work of Marie-Claude Bantier-Muller and the work on Apalai and Sergio Murias were comparing those. Generally, the presentation contributes to the description of these two languages and highlights the importance of corpora of naturally occurring speech to expand what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. And now we have about 9 minutes for questions, more or less. And right immediately after this question period, we'll start the keynote presentation, okay? And so, are there any questions? Okay, there are two. Is Stephanie Farmer or Zach, whoever?
Sorry, it's actually me. Thanks for the talk, Jorge. I was wondering, just on your last slide about typological conclusions and the rarity of genitive classifiers, if you think that we may sometimes miss the presence of especially restricted systems of genitive classifiers. And I was all this talk about domesticated animals and pets in your talk, and the preceding one was reminding me of a construction in Omagua and Kukama with the noun muma, which is domesticated animal, and it's not grammatically obligatory, but very common to say things like muma atawari, my domesticated animal hen, as opposed to just Tatawadi, my hen. And I was just wondering, I wouldn't call it a genitive classifier, but certainly it probably seems worth mentioning in a description in the context of these classifiers.
Yeah. And in Kokama also applies to plants, sorry. Like my cotton that I'm taking care of. Go ahead, Jorge, sorry.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I do think that these are perhaps more common than we suspect. And that's why I was saying that there is an importance here in having a naturalistic data. So where speakers are using their language in the context that they normally would, in an elicitation context, you wouldn't necessarily think of asking that unless you have read something that would indicate that it could be there. But when you start analyzing people's speech, then you realize how these constructions emerge in where they're formed. So I know Natalia is here, but Javarana has a system similar to Panare. There's important differences between the Caliban systems and the Saliban system. But for example, I didn't know that NatDev had a similar system, and so that was very interesting to know. I was going to say, well, Northwest Amazonian stuff, because I do actually share a lot of other things. But it's interesting to hear that Kokama has something similar to. In the systems that I'm familiar with, it seems like pets are very salient.
Thank you.
There are questions from Patty and Spike. Patty?
Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting. It's more of a comment than a question, but I would love to see what people think about this. And that's that this restricted set of possessive classifiers that particularly involve pet animals versus eaten animals. It's something that in the literature I had initially just come across it for Chaco languages, but it's looking more and more like it's really widespread. And just the observation I think that's really intriguing is that especially if you get into the anthropological literature about Amazonia, it's very clear that native Amazonians pretty generally have very different relationship with animals that are raised as pets versus those that are eaten. And it's not the same thing. You don't raise an animal to eat it, ever, right? And so it seems like this is a really interesting, possible place where you might make the argument that grammar is kind of reflecting a cultural pattern in an interesting way. And I just was curious to see if you or anyone else had thoughts about that.
I think that's an interesting point. A point that I had, at least for Piaroa, thought about, and Tania Granadillo kind of mentioned this possible idea. So you can have examples. I showed you an example with peccary having onya, and so, but you could also use it with ukwa, and in that case, you're referring more to the meat and already kind of cooked. And so, and you could have a baby peccary that you're raising as a pet. And so peccary could be used with all three of those classifiers, but the context of use would be very different. And so that's why I think that they do make a very important semantic contribution. And in trying to understand the difference between onya and ukwa, Tania said, and I haven't asked speakers whether this is true, that thinking that for a wild animal to become food that you can consume, you have to pray over it, or traditionally you would have had to. Could that be a distinction between the two? Because they do have a similar distribution with animals that are to be eaten. But so the corpse that you hunt and you carry on your back would be onya, but once you've cooked it, then it's ukwa. So I don't know, but it's an interesting kind of avenue of asking speakers about the difference in use of the two.
Thank you, Jorge. Spike?
Thank you, Jorge. I enjoyed this. It does remind me of a debate that we've had over the years in the Caribbean group of linguists on, do you want to, it's a matter of definition. It doesn't strike me that it's so different, the phenomena throughout the family, But some people just say, well, that's not classifiers. Those are just generic nouns. And you happen to use them to possess unpossessable nouns. So from a functional perspective, there's no problem saying it functions to allow possession of entities that are not directly possessable. But from a grammatical perspective, it's not clear that there's any difference between these classifiers / generic nouns and any other noun in the language, only that you have to use them if you want to possess an unpossessable noun. So it seems to be like there's a tension between defining these things formally and functionally, and potentially the word classifier system evokes more systematicity than we in fact have. So I just wanted to get your take on that particular. Is that debate relevant for the data you were just citing?
I spent about an hour talking to Natalia Cáceres about that this morning while I was walking my dog, and the difference from what I've seen on the Caribbean examples, for example, is if you have both the noun and the generic term, which is, I realize that's what many people call it, they can come at different places in the sentence, right? So like one can be before the verb and the other one can be after the verb. So like, in a way, if you're really considering them to be a noun phrase, it would be a discontinuous noun phrase. That's never the case in Piaroa or Mako. So like they have to be together.
You need to stick in here, though. This is true of everything else that would be called part of a noun phrase in Caribbean as well. Your demonstrative can occur on the other side of the verb from the noun that it's modifying. You know, there are no adjectives per se, but nominalization, so noun and noun. So apposition is how attributive modification seems to happen. So it's not clear that for the Caribbean context, it's not clear that that is not commensurate to what you're describing for the Saliban languages, just that there is actually a noun phrase.
I think it just, I mean, terms aside, I remember Scott Delancey telling me, do not ask me what to call something. Terminology can be a very kind of idiosyncratic issue. You can choose whatever you want to call it. If you describe it well enough, then other people can compare it with something else. I think one thing that I would have with using generic terms rather than generic classifiers is that it kind of, in a certain way, kind of obscures the classificatory function they have. There's no freedom of using things. I mean, they're making a semantic contribution, sure, but I think that there is a fair amount of semantic cohesiveness within the subclasses that are used for each generic noun, if that makes any sense. I mean, my understanding of the Caribbean data is that.
Yeah, to the point that there are 5 different verbs for eating or drinking, and there are 5 different generic nouns that possess the things that fall into the categories of things that you eat. Is pretty systematic.
Okay, any other question? We are, well, actually, I think we have to wrap up. And so we're gonna go ahead and thank everybody that has participated in this symposium.